What's going on YouTube? Username Kite562 here, and I have another review for you, and it is of the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. Now, I tried recording this video with my mic headset, but the audio just turned to absolute trash, so I decided to re-record it. So anyway, this video is going to be a long one. There's going to be a lot of side notes mentioned from my experience from all 11 short stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So sit back and relax and listen to my review of the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. Starting off with Silver Blaze, or The Silver Blaze. So, the plot is that Sherlock and Watson try to go on a trip to Dartmoor, to King's Pyland, to be specific, to investigate the case of a disappearance of a favorite player for the Wessex Cup, along with the murder of the trainer. So for the first side note of this story, the case has Sherlock brooding around in his thoughts, since this could affect Sherlock's ability of analysis and deduction. Since, accordingly, from what I can remember, it was a quite memorable case, in my opinion, and quite challenging. And so for the second side note, John Straker is the name of the jockey that trained with the Colonel Ross for 5 years, and a jockey, and as a jockey, and 7 years as a trainer. And I have to say the most notable quote from this story is, "Immediately beyond there was a bowl-shaped depression in the moor, and at the bottom of this was found the dead body of the unfortunate trainer. His head had been shattered by a savage blow from some heavy weapon. He was wounded in the thigh, where there was a long, clean cut inflicted, evidently by some very sharp instrument." Silver Blaze, page 348, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And so for the third side note of this story, Colonel Ross and Inspector Gregory met up with Sherlock and Holmes and Watson. And my final thoughts, enjoyable, not a very gripping story in my eyes. I did enjoy the moments that finally put the pieces together. The culprit caught me a little by surprise. And so for the second story is Yellow Face, or The Yellow Face. So the plot for this story is that Mr. Grant Monroe, a man who was married for 3 years, suddenly is estranged by his wife. And Grant wants to figure out why, with the help of Sherlock Holmes. So for the first side note, could Grant's wife be having an affair with another man? Or was she threatened and coerced to have the affair against her wishes? And so for the second side note of this story, Grant's wife was first married as Effie Hebron to a lawyer in Atlanta. Her then husband and child died of yellow fever, and Effie moved in with her aunt in Pinner in Middlesex, according to page 364 of this story of the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And again, the book that I'm referencing is the one that I had when I'm reading Sherlock Holmes for the first time. I'll leave it up in the description below, up there. And so, for, again, the side note too, Grant's wife was first married as Effie Hebron to a lawyer in Atlanta. Her then husband and child died of yellow fever, and Effie moved in with an aunt in Pinner in Middlesex, according to page 364, The Yellow Face. So my final thoughts on this story, it was a very wholesome romance story where it was just a really nice, thoughtful experience that I do highly recommend. It's solid atmospheric moments, however enjoyable. The twist was predictable. I mean, if you can read in between the lines, you can kind of figure out the flow of everything. If you really pay attention and observe how the dialogue is being spoken to one another and who appears on the scene within the page of any Sherlock Holmes story, in my opinion. So anyway, for story number 3, The Stockbroker's Clerk, The plot for this story is John Watson bought a piece of property from a Mr. Farquhar, with which the property in question was a general practice building of medicines, since John Watson is an army surgeon, medical surgeon, not sergeant, so... So John Watson bought a medical practice building. However, Watson has a neighbor named Hull Pycroft. So for my first side note, Arthur Pinner has now entered the scene. He is a very skilled financial agent according to his business card. Arthur is now a clerk at Mawson's. Arthur also has a brother named Harry Pinner. So my final thoughts for this story is not my favorite short story from this volume, but to me this seems like an inside job mystery gone wrong, with a sudden twist attached to it. However, the wonderful descriptions of the scenarios stood out, as always, with all of the Sherlock short stories and novels. I mean, it's just a really solid experience. Like with Sherlock Holmes stories, it really gives me a Law and Order kind of vibe as I read them, like mainly with the first two novels that I read, A Study in Scarlet and then The Sign of the Four, so, which I do have reviews of up here. So, there's that. So for story number 4, The Gloria Scott, one of my favorites from this collection, I have to say The Gloria Scott, The Naval Treaty, and The Final Problem were my favorite featured short stories in this collection that stood out to me the most, but all 11 were enjoyable in their own way. It's just those 3 really stood out to me. So for the plot of The Gloria Scott is, a mysterious note appears before Sherlock and Watson that read, "The supply of game for London is steadily going up. Headkeeper Hudson, we believe, has been now told to receive all orders for fly paper and for preservation of your hen pheasant's life." Page 385 of The Gloria Scott. So for the first side note, John Watson was good friends of Victor Trevor Jr. There's also a Victor Trevor Sr., but Sr. doesn't really pop up that much in my opinion. So when Watson was in college for 2 years, could the gray paper with the mysterious message have a poison on the pages that could cause a stroke? Which Victor Trevor's father suffered from by touching this message. And it also kind of reminded me of the short story The 5 Orange Pips, or Pits, whatever you want to call them. That's another vibe that this story got to me. So for my second side note of the Gloria Scott story is, it was really surprising reveal on page 392 where we got to know more about Victor Trevor Sr. from a letter he wrote revealing some hard-hitting truths. The JA, which stands for James Armitage, a tattoo, has a lot more meaning along with the Gloria Scott. And my final thoughts on this story is that one of my favorite short stories from the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes is that it really drew me in with this reveal of the hidden truths of one's past. It honestly reminded me of the Stephen King novella Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption, which I do have a review up here, so not really related, but definitely check it out. I'll definitely pop in things like that within this video. So, story number 5, The Musgrave Ritual. As Watson tries to talk to Sherlock, as they end up talking about a previous case of his, that would be of the Musgrave Ritual, as Sherlock reveals a small wooden box with artifacts in it, retelling of the case of Reginald Musgrave. As for the ritual, it's a rite of passage or a coming-of-age ceremony, kind of like a quinceañera or a bar mitzvah, if you want to be more specific like that. Or heck, you have Sweet 16 if you want to go that far, in my opinion. But it's kind of like a royal passing of the title of Musgrave, like the head societal type of deal. So, For the first side note of this story is that Reginald and Sherlock knew each other in college before Sherlock had his office on 221B Baker Street. Sherlock lived on Montague Street, just around the corner from the British Museum, which I thought was really intriguing. And for the second side note, Reginald's father was carried off of the Hurlstone estate, which leaves Reginald with the sole responsibility of the estate. Even Sherlock hasn't crossed paths with Reginald until he asks for his help with this case, according to pages 400 and 401 of this story. And so, for the third side note of the Musgrave Ritual, Rachel Howells, who's a currently ill maid, at least according to page 402, however, Rachel seems in complete distraught after knowing of the sudden disappearance of Mr. Brunton, with only a pair of boots and his other belongings besides his black suit is the only item that's missing. And my final thoughts for the Musgrave Ritual, it was an enjoyable story, not as gripping as the Gloria Scott, and it's interesting to see some of Sherlock's cases before he settled in his office on 221B Baker Street. I mean, I really wish we could have seen some more cases of him in Montague Street near the British Museum, but that's just me. So for story number 6, the Reigate Squires, plot. On April 14th, Watson receives a telegram from a person saying Sherlock Holmes is lying ill in the Dulong Hotel from what seems to be a case of overexertion. Since you know Sherlock likes to jump around all over the place like a freaking energetic puppy, messing around with his chemical sets, doing cocaine or morphine even. So, quite an interesting fellow, Sherlock. Who had his house broken into. Now, as of recently, Hayter's butler rushes in to tell him that the coachman named William had been shot in the heart, dead by a burglar, according to page 411. And so the coachman's full name was William Kirwan. The burglar was robbing a man named Alec Cunningham. And again, Alec lives with his father. I don't know if he could be named as well Alec Cunningham Sr. So I'm just going to refer to the father as Cunningham Sr. That's just me. If you know the guy's name, please let me know down in the comments below. So my final thoughts of this story is, it was a really enjoyable story. However, some of the evidence pieces were really hard for me to read, but it was really cozy of a whodunit kind of short story with a good chunk of all the other novels and short story collections that I've read. So, on to the next story, The Crooked Man. After a midnight visit to Watson, Sherlock explains a murder of a man named Colonel Barclay of the Royal Mallows in Aldershot. So, for the first side note, the Royal Mallows are a famous Irish regiment of the British Army, according to page 424. James Barclay started out as a full private. He also married a Nancy Devoy, who was a daughter of a sergeant of the same corps. Both Mr. and Mrs. Barclay are very sociable people around the army, around their army brothers and sisters. And so for the second side note is that on page 425 of the story, that James Barclay is capable of considerable violence and vindictiveness, along with also having a handsome and sociable demeanor as well. And for the third side note of this story is that it is said on page 426 that James Barclay suffered a ragged cut to the back of the head 2 inches long at the back part of his head. Since Barclay had a collection of weapons, what was used to deal the fatal blow, but more importantly, where? So the question that I wrote down is, who would gain what from the death of Colonel Barclay? Did the suspect absolutely despise the union between Nancy Devoy and James Barclay? We may never know. Because, again, Nancy Devoy was the daughter of a former color sergeant, did her own father kill James Barclay in a fit of rage, thinking that James was not good enough for his daughter? Read this story to find out. So my final thoughts with this story is that it was an enjoyable love triangle murder mystery, along with being a romantic story where one still feels the love for someone after all the years of being apart, and the one who lost still feels a fiery passion for their beloved. And so for the next story, number 8, the plot of The Resident Patient is that Sherlock and Watson pay a visit to a man named Dr. Trevelyan, or Percy Trevelyan if you want to be more specific. The doctor tells the two men of the mysterious man named Blessington. With Trevelyan being a successful doctor, what could Blessington give this skilled doctor that he couldn't achieve on his own? So for the first side note, according to page 439, Blessington takes over the doctor's house and furnishes it, while also paying the doctor's maids. All the doctor has to do is sit in his chair until it wears out. On top of that, Trevelyan has to give Blessington 3/4 of the earnings, and the doctor can keep the other quarter for himself. And so, the doctor, Trevelyan, thought Blessington could have a condition called catalepsy, which I wrote down here in my notes, which catalepsy is a seizure-like condition or a trance that causes rigidness in the body, along with the loss of consciousness and sensations. I am not a doctor, but that's just what I found on Google. So, for the second side note, Mr. Blessington had apparently hung himself before a maid could serve the man a cup of morning tea, according to page 444. Also, the police investigator said the man has been driven out of his senses by fright within this story. So literally, Blessington had been scared to death, which I thought was kind of cliche, but still enjoyably surprising. So for my final thoughts on this story is another solid Sherlock short story. I really wish there were stories focused on some of these side characters, like John Herbron, or a single mentioned villain. Like, some of these gangs really sound interesting that make it mentioned once or twice. But anyway, on to the next story. So story number 9, The Greek Interpreter. The plot for this story is that Watson and Sherlock try to help a man named Mr. Milos, a man of Greek birth who is fluent in many different languages, but not all. Mr. Milos was the chief Greek interpreter of London. He gets picked up by a Mr. Latimer. Accompanied with him was a Greek man who Mr. Latimer seems to be friends with, or who seems to be friends with. Mr. Milos is hurried off into a window-covered carriage to an unknown location. So for my first side note that I wrote down, we get to see Sherlock's older brother Mycroft Holmes get in on the fray of this mystery, which I thought was really enjoyable to see, since Mycroft is more of a high societal man, if anything, and not a detective type. And he's rather large for a guy his age, and plus, Mycroft is 7 years older than Sherlock Holmes, according to this story. And so for my second side note, Mycroft is one of the founding members of the Diogenes Club, a club for highly intelligent, high societal men of power and status, according to page 448. And so for my third side note of this story, turns out this Greek man was named Paul Cretus from Athens, Greece. Could this Sophie woman be Paul's sister or cousin, according to the Daily News of a missing Paul Cretus of Athens, Greece in a Sophie X 2437? I guess that's just code for like a Jane Doe type of situation. If you know the details about this, please let me know down in the comments below. And that was an excerpt from page 455, just edited into my own words. So my question is, could have Sophie been forced to marry Harold Latimer, which is Mr. Latimer, but we finally get to know his first name within the middle of the story, which is Harold. So then what caused Paul Cretus to rescue his sister in an unknown place within an unknown country unfamiliar to him? So my final thoughts of this story is it was kind of predictable ending in my opinion, but still an enjoyable tale, especially near the end with Mr. Milas Mycroft and Sherlock and Watson. And it was a very enjoyable moment to me, like the very final climactic end where everything's clicked together, but they just gotta tie up some loose ends together as a team. It was just a really enjoyable, and it kind of gave me an 80s action comedy vibe in a way with this short story. So for story number 10, The Naval Treaty, sorry about that, lots of talking here. This is going to be a long video, re-recorded. John Watson receives a letter from a man named Percy Phelps. Percy informs Watson of a horrible incident that had happened. An important document has gone missing, and Percy asks his friend Watson to tell his colleague Sherlock Holmes to figure out who took it. So my first side note is, the naval treaty in question is a treaty between England and Italy, according to page 462. For my second side note, Joseph Harrison, the brother of Annie Harrison, Paul Phelps' fiancée, kind of has a Billy Zane kind of vibe to him from his character from Titanic named Chaldean Hockley from the James Cameron Titanic film. That's the kind of vibe that I got from Joseph Harrison when he first appeared on the page. It's like, oh, I got you noted down. You sound kind of suspicious to me. I mean, when it comes to Sherlock Holmes stories, you gotta truly observe and not just see. That's just how I interpret it. But continuing on from side note number 2, Percy is also the nephew of a nobleman named Lord Holthurst. And my final thoughts for the story of the Naval Treaty is that, with many layers of distractions for Sherlock to deduct, examples being Miss Tangy, she's a neighbor who likes to drink apparently, to assuming the culprit was a woman, the truth began to really reveal itself as the pieces really started to click together. Overall, an enjoyable brain teaser of a story for me, almost on the same level as the Gloria Scott, but not quite. A great read, nevertheless. It was still enjoyable, like all of these short stories were enjoyable in their own way. But again, the Gloria Scott, The Final Problem, and the Naval Treaty really stood out to me the most with these short stories, but all of them have their own charm in one way or another. So again, for the final story, The Final Problem, if you know of its controversial upbringing, you know, but I'm not going to go any further than that, so the plot of The Final Problem is that Sherlock is in the pursuit of a Professor Moriarty, as Sherlock likes to call him, the Napoleon of crime, within the whole city of London. This case may not be of the most, maybe not, but the most dangerous cases that Sherlock and Watson have ever faced. And for my first side note of this story, Sherlock offers to take Watson anywhere to any continent. This is quite odd for Sherlock when he just appeared before Watson in the middle of the night with his knuckles covered in blood, apparently trying to get over his wall to his garden, which really damaged his hand in one way or another, which I thought was really out of character for Sherlock. So again, for side note 1, Sherlock offers to take Watson anywhere to the continent. This is quite odd for Sherlock and quite out of his character. Sherlock to me seems to be all over the place, but the moments that have revealed themselves on pages 482 and 483. And for the second side note, relating to Professor Moriarty, Professor Moriarty is a terrifying foe for Sherlock, and along with having a diabolical bloodline running through Professor Moriarty's veins, Professor Moriarty, with his high range of skills, being skilled in a mathematician and very tactful, kind of like a spider with a web with every strand that leads to an illegal criminal act around London, which I thought was really interesting descriptions within this story. So it's just Moriarty is a well-layered villain, and every time Sherlock tries to get him, Moriarty seems to be like 15 steps ahead of him, or when they clash, they seem to cancel each other out. But my final thoughts for this story, there has to be a more detailed explanation to how the final problem story's ending. A heroic genius versus an evil genius can't be done in so easily in like that, in my opinion. With that said, the final problem was a really enjoyable short story. However, I feel like it's a smaller piece connected to something much bigger at play here. Could Professor Moriarty have been connected to all the other cases within the Sherlock universe or Sherlock canon in general, or like one way or another? Could have Moriarty had connections with a Mr. Jefferson Hope to help him get to London or something like that? Well, that's my question. Those are little questions like that that I wonder. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If I'm right, cool. But anyway, yeah, that's my review of the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. Thank you all for subscribing and listening to my video review. Again, I'll leave a tab here of the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes playlist. All my work is going to be in a playlist just to keep everything organized and in a fashion to where it can be easily binged. So anyway, thank you all to who liked, commented on my recent videos. Please give this video a like, comment, subscribe if you enjoy the content of this channel, and again, thank you all for 84 subscribers on this channel. It really means a lot. So this is Kite562 signing out, and as always, I hope you have a wonderful day, everybody. Later.